up and your presentation. I've never done these. I've never done electronic things with my presentation. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Michael Barone. I'm resident fellow here at American Enterprise Institute. And it's my pleasure today to welcome to AEI Professor Cass Sunstein. He's the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard Law School. He formerly was professor of law and political science at the University of Chicago for many years. He was the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, commonly known as OIRA, from 2009 to 2012 in the Obama administration. He has written more than a dozen books, and I'm happy to say that he has spoken a number of times here at AEI, and we consider him a good friend of AEI. And he's here today to talk about his latest book, which is called #Republic. I think that a reader would not have pronounced the word that way 20 years ago. But it's an important and interesting book. So please welcome Cass Sunstein to AEI.
Okay, well, it's a thrill to be back here. You all do amazing work, and I've learned so much from what's produced here on legal and regulatory matters, and I really thank you on behalf of zillions of people whom you never will meet who read what you produce. I'll tell you the origins, the unlikely origins of this book. I was blessed or cursed for the last several years to live in the Waldorf Towers, which is pretty heady stuff for a country boy from Waban, Massachusetts. And I lived there because my wife, Samantha Power, was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and that's where the UN ambassador has lived. For the first few months, the people at the Waldorf Towers would greet me in the morning and the evening by saying, "Hello, Mr. Power. Good evening, Mr. Power. How are you, Mr. Power?" And that was fine, except that one of them had become quite a good friend after several months, in the sense that I knew him and talked to him every day. And it was a little awkward that he was calling me by a name other than my own. So I said to him after a few months with some embarrassment, it's Cass Sunstein. You can call me Cass or Mr. Sunstein as you choose, but my name is Cass Sunstein. And he looked at me with incredulity and he said, that's unbelievable. He said, "That's amazing. You look exactly like Mr. Power." And that was intriguing to me in the sense that he was not an irrational person. He was updating basically his beliefs based on the new information, and he believed it was more likely that there were two people who looked exactly the same walking around his building than that the ambassador's husband had a different name from her. And given his prior beliefs, that was not irrational. It turned out to be wrong, but it was not irrational. Okay, here's the United States of America in many respects today, where people are asserting their correctness and the falsehoods emanating from the other side. This has implications not only for our capacity to handle problems that cut across people's ideology, but also affects how people think about one another, so much so that there is a phenomenon, partyism, which isn't as ugly as racism, but which in some respects is larger. The number of people who would be unhappy if their child married someone of the opposing political party is higher than the percentage of people who would be unhappy if their child married someone of a different race. Amazed by this finding, I, a few years ago, tried to find out whether people would be more unhappy if their child married someone of a different political party than if their child married someone of the same sex. We're not there yet, but we're getting there, which suggests that the intensity of partyism is growing rapidly. And as of 2017, it's immensely higher than it was a couple of years ago, probably a couple of days ago too. But a couple of decades ago, when people basically didn't care if their child married someone of a different political party. And this is showing up in other measures of animus, so that people actually discriminate in employment decisions against people whose political party is different from their own. Okay, here are some issues where partyism is causing problems. Whatever you think should be done about infrastructure, chances are good something should be done about infrastructure. And the intensity of disagreement between Republicans and Democrats is actually relatively modest on that issue, and yet nothing's happened yet. AUMF is technical talk for authorizations for the use of military force. To get an authorization for the use of military force in areas where the level of consensus across Democrats and Republicans is pretty high is really difficult. With respect to immigration and judges, we could have much more agreement than we're observing. The nuclear option taken by the Democrats first and now the Republicans is testimony to the difficulty of moving beyond party affiliation as a way of producing generally agreeable results. In Washington, my job in Washington, I noticed in some meetings with people of a political party that I will not name, a very sharp disagreement between their privately expressed moderation and their publicly expressed immoderation. And I should just say I observed that between both political parties, with a kind of poignant plea. Would it that it were the case that our privately expressed moderation, if publicly expressed, would not cost us our jobs? And the extent to which people complaining of that risk were also complaining of the effect of social media on their capacity to retain their jobs if they expressed moderation. That was what is very visible to them. Okay, now I'm going to tell you about 3 empirical studies which are not involving the internet precisely, but which are replicating, I think, in an experimental setting, what is happening every hour of every day on Twitter and Facebook. Okay, the first experiment comes from Colorado, and the idea was to get people from Boulder, which is left of center, together to discuss climate change, affirmative action, and same-sex unions, and to get people from Colorado Springs, which is right of center, to do exactly the same thing. And we did a reality check to make sure that our Colorado Springs participants were right of center and that our Boulder people were left of center, and not amazingly, they were. What we did was to record their anonymous views privately, to have them deliberate together to a public verdict on these issues, and then to record their anonymous views privately after they'd talked with one another. Now, what interested me as one of 3 authors of the project was only one question. How would their views shift in their anonymous pre-deliberation statements to their anonymous post-deliberation statements? What would those discussions do to how they thought about the 3 issues when they were recording their judgments in a way that no one would ever see except the experimenters? Here's what happened. 3 things. People in Colorado Springs got more unified than they were before they started to talk. Before they started to talk, there were some people in Colorado Springs who thought, I'm kind of worried about climate change. Maybe we should have an international agreement. Not after the discussion. There were people in Boulder who thought, well, affirmative action has some problems. I think it's a form of race discrimination. There was some diversity in Boulder Springs. After they talked briefly, the diversity was crushed in their private anonymous statements. The second thing that happened was they got more confident. The people in Colorado Springs on same-sex unions, some of them just weren't sure. They didn't like them so much, but they weren't sure. After they talked, they were sure. The third thing that happened, and the most disturbing and I think illuminating, is they got more extreme in both sides. The people in Colorado Springs were to the right, here. The people in Boulder were to the left, here. But they were like here, this range. After our little experiment, they were like here. They were operating in different political universes in their private anonymous views. Now, what I've just described, a very artificial experiment, that's what social media constructs, doesn't it? A capacity to create the functional equivalent of our experimental groups. Why did this happen? I've actually seen the tapes of the discussion. We could roll the tapes if you wanted. And here's what you'd see in real time. First, in Colorado Springs, the place where they started kind of skeptical about a climate change treaty, and in the end, very, very skeptical, the number of arguments in their discussion that supported the international treaty were few. That's not amazing. That's a statistical inevitability. The number of arguments that opposed an international treaty were numerous. Also an inevitability given the initial distribution of views. If people are listening to one another, and human beings typically do, they would end up more skeptical about the treaty after they heard the various arguments. And in Boulder, exactly the same thing happened in the mirror. That is, on affirmative action, some people didn't like it very much. Most people liked it plenty. The arguments that supported it crushed the arguments that undermined it, and people thought, oh gosh, most of the arguments are supportive of it. That produced confidence, unity, extremism. The second thing is slightly more subtle, and you could see this in real time, and I think each of us can see this in our daily lives, whether the issue involves what products to buy, what people to like, or what political view to hold on an issue. And here's the phenomenon. Most people who don't have a ton of information tend toward the middle. They become tentative because of humility. When the view is corroborated by members of the human species, the humility diminishes, they become confident and more extreme. So, confidence is increased by corroboration, and you can see that in both cities, and corroboration makes for more intensity of commitment to the view. And that helps account for the finding. The third involves reputation. People don't want, in a group of people who tend to think, let's say, affirmative action is great, they don't want to look like racists or idiots in front of one another, and so they end up saying, I think like affirmative action plenty, even if they privately didn't 10 minutes before. And then in their private anonymous statement of view, it would be very awkward to say, oh, what they'd said publicly, they don't actually believe. So their private view lines up with their public view. Okay, here's the second of the 3 studies, and this does not involve, professors or think tank people trying to construct something. This involves the world. And it benefits the study from a serendipitous fact, which is on 3 judge panels in the United States, Court of Appeals panels. The possible composition is Reagan, Bush appointees, Obama, Clinton appointees, Obama, Reagan appointees, and Bush, Clinton appointees, meaning 3R appointees, 3D appointees, two D and one R appointee, two Rs and one D appointee. And that's it. That's all that can be possible. Okay, here's the headline finding. While the political party of the appointing president is a pretty good predictor of how a judge is going to vote in an ideologically contested case, not fantastic, but pretty good, the political party of the two other judges, of the president who appointed the two other judges on the panel, is at least as good and often a better predictor of how that judge is going to vote. Got it? You want to know how Judge X is going to vote? Don't ask whether Obama or Trump appointed Judge X. Do ask whether Obama or Trump appointed the two other judges with whom Judge X is sitting. Okay, here's the most dramatic finding. While in the aggregate data, there's about a 13 percentage point difference in the likelihood of a liberal vote between an R and a D appointee, roughly 13 percentage points, which is concerning but not catastrophic from the point of view of the rule of law. The likelihood of a liberal vote on a DDD panel is frequently 30 to 40% higher than the likelihood of a liberal vote from a judge on an RRR panel. That is to say, a D judge on a DDD panel shows phenomenally liberal voting patterns, and an R judge on an RRR panel shows phenomenally conservative voting patterns, where the word phenomenal means just compared to how they vote in aggregate. Now, what makes that a startling finding, in my view, is a D on a DDR panel, if you're with me, the Ds have the votes. If it involves whether the EPA's greenhouse gas regulation is lawful, they can do what they want. They've got the votes. Why is it that Ds on DDR panels show much more moderate voting patterns than Ds on DDD voting panels? I think it's about information, at least in part. What are they hearing? A D on a DDD panel, that's Boulder. An R on an RRR panel, that's Colorado Springs. And what makes the statistics not expected is that what we're observing is legal professionals, judges, learned in the law, answering not a political question, but a legal question. And even so, the selection through random draw into something like an information cocoon produces systematically more extreme results. Now, the data I've told you, I think, actually understates the magnitude of the phenomenon. We just collected votes. By we, I mean me and a team of law students who, if they're not in mental institutions now, I'm very relieved, because counting many thousands of votes, that's not fun. They did it nonetheless. What I didn't ask them to do, because it's much harder, is to explore the relative extremism of the opinion rather than just the up or down vote. So we're asking, did a woman win in a sex discrimination case? Did an EPA regulation get upheld or not? Did something the National Labor Relations Board did get struck down? That's what we're asking. We're not asking what's the reasoning. There's every reason to think on a DDD panel, whoa, and so too on an RRR panel. Whoa is the technical law professor term, if you're unfamiliar with it, for OMG. Okay. Here's one other story of updating. You heard the Waldorf story, which I think is explanatory of some of what happened in Colorado. The other story of updating comes, of course, from Star Wars. And I did a little book on Star Wars, so I researched Star Wars. And there was a debate between, forgive me, did you think you hear something about Star Wars, or does this seem very surprising or terrible? One little Star Wars story. The debate was between Lawrence Kasdan, a great American screenwriter, and George Lucas on killing the main characters in Return of the Jedi. And Lawrence Kasdan said, you've got to kill Luke Skywalker. And George Lucas, Luke, he says, Luke isn't going to die. And then Kasdan says, well, kill Leia. Leia has to die. And George Lucas says, Leia's not going to die. It's not nice. You don't go around killing people. And then Kasdan said, well, kill Yoda. And he says, Yoda, I'm not going to kill Yoda. I mean, maybe he dies in a way, but he comes back. And then Kasdan gets I think in his soul, he gets real. And he gives a speech about art. And he's saying, I'm saying that the movie has more emotional weight if someone you love is lost along the way. The journey has more impact. He's talking about culture and art. And Lucas says very quickly, one sentence, I don't like that and I don't believe that. Now notice the beautiful architecture of the sentence. Not liking precedes and probably helps account for not believing. The Waldorf story, my friend, didn't particularly dislike the idea that I had a different name from my wife. He didn't believe it, just it seemed that couldn't be true. Here it's about the emotional commitment preceding the belief. Okay, here's the last study. How good looking do you think you are on a bounded scale of 1 to 10? If you would, think about it. I have some news for you. That's you. Okay. Now what do you think, having heard my news for you? Let's do a second experiment. Ask the same question. How good looking do you think you are? I actually have some news for you. That's you. Okay, here's what the data suggests, that people are asymmetrical updaters in the sense that good news has a much bigger impact than bad news. If people estimate that they are a 6 on the scale, and then some credible outsider says you're actually an 8, they say, oh, I'm a 7 or 8. I've learned. If they say I'm a 6, and then some credible outsider says they're a 4, they say, no, that's not true. I'm a 6. People believe the good news, not the bad news. Okay, this is true for many personal things with respect to the risk of having diabetes, insomnia, infertility, being vandalized, being trapped in an elevator, having a mouse or a rat in your house. That sounds a little like Dr. Seuss. Apologies for that. The information processing regularity is good news people will update much more reliably with than bad news. Bad news, they'll say, that's noise. Good news, they'll say, oh. Okay, so we know there is an asymmetry, and it turns out to have neurological foundations. There's an identifiable part of the brain that blocks updating with respect to bad news, and if you zap it, then the good news, bad news effect disappears. Okay, so what I was interested in and am interested in is how this works for political information. So here's what we did. We got initial study, which I'll tell you about. This has been replicated with more people. We got basically 300 plus Americans, recruited them, and sorted them into 3 groups based on their answers to questions about the environment. 3 terciles: strong climate change believers, weak climate change believers, and moderate climate change believers. Creative names for our 3 terciles. And the data we got is not surprising in terms of their anticipated warming. The strong believers think by 2100 we're going to go to 6.3 degrees Fahrenheit, the moderates 5.9, and the weak 3.6. Okay, the only thing that's interesting there is that the weak believers are not at 1 or 0, they're at 3.6. They're the bottom tercile. And that's probably roughly where America's bottom tercile is. Okay, here's what we did, which is internet relevant and trying to figure out how people process information. With now quite large samples, we randomly assigned people to one of 2 conditions. In the good news condition, you're not going to have a mouse in your house. You're better looking than you think. We told people, actually scientists have come in with some terrific news. The climate situation's better than they thought. The likely increase is 1 to 5 degrees. And stuff like that people are seeing on Twitter and Facebook or the Wall Street Journal all the time, yes? We gave the other half bad news. Scientists have some tough information for you. It's worse than we thought, 7 to 11 degrees. And people are getting that on Twitter and Facebook and the New York Times all the time, yes? So there's realism in this fruit flies-like experiment. Okay, what do you think would happen? The weak believers in climate change are like the people with respect to appearance. And this is the bottom tercile. Getting the good news, their estimate fell by a full 1 degree from 3.6 to 2.6. And given that the baseline is low, 3.6, that falling, that's very dramatic. They really updated getting the good news. Getting the bad news, they were unmoved at all. Zero impact. Now, in terms of social science, that's not going to get any prize because it fits with everything you've heard before and just applies it to politics. It is, I think, politically explosive, suggesting, think Affordable Care Act, immigration, terrorism, the effect of the minimum wage. There's a bottom tercile who will treat good news as very informative, gun control, and bad news as who paid them. Our top tercile showed exactly the opposite pattern. These are the strong climate change believers who aren't panicking, but they are the most worried top third of America. They were far more moved by the bad news than the good news. Getting the bad news, their average estimate jumped by 2 degrees. Getting the good news, it fell by less than half of that, which suggests that systematically people who are really scared of climate change will be jumping in terms of their level of fear when they get new scientific information suggesting things are bad, and they'll be dropping just a little bit when they get good news suggesting the problem isn't as large. Okay, what you've just heard, I think, is basically a really simplified version of what happens on the social media every day in real time, where people are getting both versions of our interventions and where a bunch of people are reacting asymmetrically in a way that is opposite to the way a bunch of other people are reacting. Okay, what's the explanation for this last study, which I confess I find the most intriguing of the three? We don't know. One possibility is, I don't like that, and I don't believe that. Motivated reasoning. The other explanation is that people are just updating in a rational way. It's like the Waldorf Towers tale, in which people are thinking, given my prior conviction, it's going to get really hot. I hear science suggesting it's not. There must be identical twins walking around. That can't be true. Exxon must have paid them. And there are others who see the bad news who say, that's an environmental group's climate science, quote unquote. I don't believe that. Whereas the good news is more credible to me. And that is not a motivated reasoning story. It's a story given your prior convictions, what you've learned from the new information. Okay, almost done. Facebook, 2016. Our success is built on getting people the stories that matter to them most. This is a direct quote. If you could look through thousands of stories every day and choose the 10 that were most important to you, what would they be? The answer should be your news feed. It is subjective, personal, and unique, and defines the spirit of what we hope to achieve. Really? What they are speaking about is an architecture of control in which either algorithms or individual choices are creating DDD and RRR panels, and that's being celebrated as freedom in a democratic society. Okay, Jane Jacobs, the hero of my little book, wrote a great book on the death and life of the great American cities, in which she urged that in great cities like Washington or New York or Berlin or Paris, or small city versions of these that many of us come from, they may have a degree of homogeneity, but in all of them there's an architecture of serendipity. You will come across people of different ages, different skin colors, different backgrounds, different tragedies, different joys, different aspirations, different failures, and you will see them in the course of a week. They will enlarge you, they will disturb you, They may change your day and possibly your life. And what Jacobs was really urging is that a great city is like a stream, an information stream. And the beauty of it is that it's the opposite of the Facebook vision of an architecture of control. It's something that is full of unanticipated, unplanned, unchosen encounters that turn out to be, in her view, the lifeblood of freedom in a democratic society. Last bit is from Jacobs' forerunner, John Stuart Mill, a theorist of liberty and self-government too, who urged, "It is hardly possible to overrate the value in the present low state of human improvement of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves, with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Such communication has always been, and is peculiarly in the present age, one of the primary sources of progress." Thanks.
I want to thank Professor Sunstein, Cass, Mr. Power, for a very interesting and illuminating presentation. Let me propound a couple of questions for you just as sort of takeoff points or something. You've argued in #Republic that things have gotten worse in this respect in the last 20 years. The technology, Facebook, social media have exacerbated what you portray as a problem of people being unduly negative and responding in that way to each other, polarizing and being isolated in silos, in hostile silos, if you will. You offer some solutions in the book. But what if there's a nudge to which people don't budge? To use a phrase, you don't advocate government regulation of the internet. Can you give the listeners an idea of what solutions and how hopeful you are? You know, you say at one point people should be polite to each other. That's a lot of garbage.
Okay, so there's a great psychologist, Amos Tversky, who would have won the Nobel Prize had he not died young, who said he's an optimist because it's irrational to be pessimistic, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice. First, when you're sad about what's going to happen, and second, when the bad thing happens. So in terms of hopefulness about the future, absolutely. In terms of solutions, the book is, maybe in autobiographical counterpoint to my very cheerful Star Wars book. It's basically a problem-focused book rather than a solution-focused book. In terms of what can be done, there's something about providers of information, there's something about individual lives. Our culture is a construction of what each of us does. So let's talk about providers first and then culture. So if you're running Facebook, you saw the passage from 2016. There's something seductive and intuitive about what was said there. That was written by someone who's extremely intelligent and also who has a value. But it's not the right value, it's not the full value. And from Facebook's public pronouncements, they're rethinking this a bit. So you could easily imagine Facebook experimenting with, let's say, a serendipity button, where you press something and in your newsfeed comes a random draw of things that aren't necessarily what an algorithm or your own behavior would have selected. That would be worth experimenting with. Or something else which is actually blossoming, not to my knowledge on Facebook itself, but through private sector creativity, is an opposing viewpoints button, where you could just click on it, and then you get, for a certain amount of stuff that comes on your newsfeed, things that think differently from how you think. And it could make you, very unhappy that you clicked the button, because why are they sending me this nonsense? But it could make you think, oh, these people are even sillier than I thought, and it's good to know that. Or it might make you think, oh, they actually have some ideas which are not unreasonable, and I'm glad to hear them. And so those would be two things to experiment with. The second approach, that is the use of algorithms to expose people to lots of stuff, that's something which there are about 12 out there right now. Some of them are startups, some of them you can download as an app tomorrow. Now, Facebook, whether it would move, I'm using Facebook as a placeholder for social media generally. It looks like the leadership both is providing a service to which it has an economic commitment and a service to which it has a large ideological commitment, not in the sense of political, but thinking, if people can connect with their friends across geography and communicate with their children or with people who they hadn't known since high school, that's fantastic. And there's something that's admirable about that. They also, I think, are alert to the fact that they're having an increasingly large democratic function. They shouldn't play favorites or try to make kings, but they can think that one of the things we're doing is something like what the great news providers of the 1950s did.
If they start curating things, Facebook's employment base, about 85-90% Democratic. Can they curate fairly?
Well, the word curate is ambiguous. I think if they curated in a way that picked a particular position, that would be objectionable for any number of reasons, and it would probably not be in their economic interest. So there are people who curate along ideologically defined ways, and bless them, they're allowed. Facebook almost certainly shouldn't do that. So the question is, what is the problem that Facebook's news feed is part of? And Facebook is not the source of ideological polarization in America, but it could be helpful rather than harmful. The problem is that people are often sorted into information cocoons that fit with their pre-existing predilections. Some people who are so sorted actually have aspirations that are different from their own behavior Tuesday at 10 a.m. They would like to see other stuff. And if their news feeds looked like that, they'd be a little happier with their week. So try it. They could do that.
Well, certainly websites I consult regularly have a certain amount by smart people who write about things I don't know a lot about and who link to opposing views with fair regularity. This doesn't describe the whole universe. You describe the Jane Jacobs description of Greenwich Village, Hudson Street, 1950s, as a diverse area. If you go down Hudson Street today, 90% of the people you encounter are all of one political belief, one whole set. They're in one silo, or we can describe it with fair accuracy. It's another place where you find that is a place where you've spent most of your professional career in the universities. Universities today have speech codes. They have restrictions. They're shouting down, violently attacking speakers. Administrations are not doing anything about this, except tutting slightly and saying how much they hate the speakers too, including our own Charles Murray here at AEI. Aren't universities one of the most closed-minded silos going on in America today? I grew up in a 92% Republican suburb, and I went to a 58% Democratic university called Harvard. That's how they voted in the straw poll for Kennedy and Nixon in 1960. Nowadays, the typical student goes from a 58% either Republican or Democratic suburb and goes to a 92% university. Aren't universities part of the problem rather than the solution?
Well, there's an empirical question here, and the data you suggest is very impressive. I'm a little at a disadvantage because I spent most of my career at the University of Chicago, which on two counts is different from the picture you describe. One of which is it's been the national leader in opposing the idea of any kind of politically driven speech code. And the administration of the University of Chicago has stood firm on principle. My co-author and friend Jeff Stone, who's left of center, is yields to no one, I think.
Well, I think it may be fairly said, your own scholarship shows a fine degree of civility and openness to a range of ideas, but continue.
Thank you for that. I do think that if any academic identifies himself or herself in a way that is very ideologically describable, they're not doing their job. Because it would be amazing if, suppose you're a political scientist, if your views on 12 of the leading issues today, on every one, lined up with one of our current political parties. That would be amazing in a bad way. Yes? So the University of Chicago, I want to make one other point, which is that, and I think in this way, as well as in the no speech codes way, it's a model. And I'm completely with you with Charles Murray, who, that's in a free society or even an unfree society, the way he was treated is a disgrace. So unfree society should be free, and unfree society should not treat people in that disgraceful way. But also at the University of Chicago, the number of people who were thought the Democratic Party's full of nonsense and still think that is significant. And the intellectual leadership in the two places in the University of Chicago that I know, the law school and the economics department, that's long come from the right. And my current institution, Harvard Law School, many of the top people there are either right of center or could not be described as left of center.
Yeah.
And that's that 92% number you give, that's alarming.
Is there an awareness of a problem that needs to be solved here at the highest academic levels, or is they got $32 billion, the heck with worrying about it?
Well, I'll tell you my general reaction to this. It's undoubtedly a product of my experience over the last X years. So our country has a number of challenges. 40,000 people died on the highways in 2016. That's an increase. Our infrastructure isn't great. Our unemployment level, while down, remains too high. Our GDP growth isn't high enough. The problem of persistent poverty and inadequate educational preparation, those remain serious. And I'll tell you why I'm listing this, and I'm not going to continue, but you get the drift. You could add your own preferred candidates. These are really serious problems, and they are things on which the United States could make much more progress than it has. So our educational institutions, they are the pride of the world. We have the best. And the contributions to knowledge our educational institutions are providing, whether it involves computers or basic science or even economics, it's really something. We're the best there is. And so my focus, I think academics particularly focus too much on universities. And that is important. But the main problem ailing America today isn't about what's happening at Oberlin. The main problems are people dying prematurely for Y or Z reason.
Is there an argument in #Republic, perhaps even in the title, for subsidiarity, for the principle of deciding decisions to the extent possible on a more local rather than federal or national basis? When you have these cultural divisions that are unbridgeable, does it really make sense to have Washington decide transgender bathroom behavior? That has to be a national, or for the state legislature in Raleigh, or even for the city council in Charlotte to decide that issue. And can you give us some of your thoughts on in what areas that might be helpful to do, and in other areas where it's not a good idea?
It's a great question. So there's an old political science paper called Gag Rules and Democracy. And the theory is on issues on which people are kind of at loggerheads, they might just not talk to each other about those issues and just proceed on issues on which they can talk.
This is one. you hoped Uncle Bob wouldn't bring up politics at Thanksgiving.
No, right, exactly. And so I think this is a brilliant insight, and it's closely connected to your point. You might think if the national government is going to break down over X or Y issues, where it's going to kind of inflame everybody, then the argument for having states and localities sorted out their own way is strengthened. And that's not addressed in the book. The book isn't about what level of government should solve various problems, but it's a reasonable and I think fair inference. It's a point. That is the idea that where we are inflamed with each other and it's paralyzing things, maybe the states and localities, it's a point. But as the last part of your question suggests, whether the point is decisive or just one of 7 considerations depends on the area. So in the environmental context, if certain states are polluting other states, then there's an argument for a national solution to prevent the interstate crossover pollution.
Yeah.
So the first mission of the Environmental Protection Agency in principle should be not to set ambient air quality standards for each state, but to make sure that each state doesn't create adverse environmental impacts on other states. And there's actually a rule from the EPA called the cross-state rule, which follows that theory. So the environmental issue, probably a good one to think what levels of water pollution to, what levels of reduction in aggressive national minima might make sense given states' capacity to handle that themselves, and where do we have a problem that states can't handle given that one state's adversely affecting another. Now, it might be that the national authorities have some capacity to figure out environmental impacts that some states lack, which would suggest some minima, but maybe in some contexts, very plausibly, the minima should be less aggressive than they now are. The transgender one is super interesting. The question would be whether we should think of the transgender issue as sufficiently subject to reasonable doubt that a national solution makes no sense, or whether we should think of it in the way that most people now think of race discrimination as one where there's a characteristic which is not legitimately the basis for mistreatment. And the transgender issue isn't one I've thought a whole lot about, but the question would be in which bin it falls. So there are areas that even march under the rubric of discrimination where the national government doesn't step in. There's some people who think of a more capacious notion of what counts as age discrimination the federal law does, and maybe they can do that in California if they're worried about that thing, but we don't want a national age discrimination thing that has that degree of, let's say, provocativeness, given the fact that some people think that kind of age discrimination, that's life. And California needn't think, you get where I'm going. So the fact that it's a moral issue doesn't necessarily mean we need a centralized solution. So I think you've got a strong point, and if we took some domains where the federal government is at loggerheads and just put it in the states and localities, then the intensity of central blockage would, of course, diminish.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost an implication. One of Justice Ginsburg's pre-Supreme Court statements on abortion suggests that, in fact, that if Roe v. Wade had not given a single national standard, this would not have been as great an issue.
Yes, I think both Marianne Glendon, who worked, she was ambassador of the Vatican under President Bush, and Justice Ginsburg are correct in saying Roe against Wade was a blunder to nationalize issues on which states with their diverse values were resolving in different ways in a way that involved evolving thinking.
We had maybe these I've had the thought of reading your book that maybe these problems are not new. If you go back in time between a period that you can say the passage of the Radio Act of 1930, which begins federal, under that statist Herbert Hoover, begins the federal regulation of electronic communications medium, and the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, which you say in the book was warranted, at least at that time, as an intelligent policy decision and should not be revisited. You had, in this country something in what I call universal media. You had everybody listened to the radio, to just a few stations. Everybody went to the movies. I mean, daily movie attendance. 1930, America had 123 million people. Average weekly movie attendance was 100 million every week. That's a universal medium. Television in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, incidentally, President Reagan, and I think one of the reasons for his political success, made his pre-political career entirely in all three of those media, in radio, in movies, and television. He embodied and spoke naturally the language of universal media, common national values. Those movies, those things still speak to us. They provided a common language. Technology has clearly changed that. But prior to 1930, we were living in an America which was not as connected, did not have as prevalent a universal culture. Can you think of any lessons on how to cope with that might occur to you from that other America?
I'm thinking the question helps explain probably the saddest statistic that exists, which is that Gone with the Wind beats Star Wars: A New Hope as the inflation-adjusted box office winner. You don't look particularly sad to hear that statistic, but
Gone with the Wind, which views on racial views are things that we really don't like.
Well, I think it's a great movie, and I love the movie, and the book is phenomenal and fascinating, but Star Wars should be number one. Still, you give the right explanation, which is that there was a time when everyone went to the movies, and they went to the same movies. And while Star Wars was released at a time when there was less diversity and nicheification than there is now, there's a neutral reason that Gone with the Wind beats Star Wars. It's not better, it's not more popular, it was produced in an era of more universal media. That wasn't the answer you were looking for, though, exactly. So you're clearly right historically that we have an era of, I like the term universal media. Sometimes the providers of information in that era, which is receding, have been referred to as general interest intermediaries. That was a short-ish time in human history, and it's weakening. And then the question you ask is, what can we learn from the prior era? The only thing I would add is that in terms of the challenges we face, in a way they're more intense than then, even if the level of universal experience is not lower now than it was then, because the ability of each of us to find a zillion people who think exactly as we do, that has no precedence. So if you think, that somebody, name your least favorite politician, should be in jail, and it could be somebody who most people love. Is there someone who most people love? It could be Michael Jordan. Most people love Michael Jordan. If you think he should be in jail, that may be an exception, but the general proposition is you can find a zillion people who agree with you, that person should be in jail. And in the other times when we didn't have universal...
This is the Athens thing, throwing Aristides the just out of town.
Yeah, completely. So the ability to find a very large number of people who think whatever you think, and to do that in 1 second, it's great in a way, especially if they don't think exactly what you think, if you can learn something from them. But to find yourself in the coziest place in the world of people who will fortify your, let's say, eccentric view, that's different from any time. When you might find 14 people or 24 who agree with you, but it's a little like the Colorado experiment, not with groups of 6, but with groups of 700. And then the unity, extremism, confidence would have grown.
That pre-1930 period also had featured a little something called a civil war. We got a national issue, slavery in the territories, that people were unwilling to compromise on. And you pointed to a number of unsolved or insufficiently addressed public policy areas that I think most people would agree varying extents on with you on. Do you see a threat as big as that? As big as, or what are the big threats you see that might keep you worrying at night?
Okay, so the Civil War reference is great because it points up something about Lincoln that's, I think, not sufficiently prominent in public celebrations with Lincoln. And that is, Lincoln was an opponent of slavery for all of his adult life in a kind of uncompromising way. But he was not an opponent of eliminating slavery for today, for much of his adult life. And he saw no contradiction there. He said, you know, the fact that a majority of white people want slavery is highly relevant, and whether they are wrong or right actually isn't relevant to the issue of what to do today. The fact of their intense views, that's a block. And it wasn't that he thought they might be right. It's that we have to combine clarity on the principle with pragmatism about how to get there in a way that's respectful of what other members of the human species think. So it was that relationship between pragmatism and principle that defined his thinking about slavery. Now, he wasn't able to avoid a civil war. I don't think we are in danger of anything like that. So the closest thing to keeping me up at night is thinking that, you know, there are human tragedies all around us. Probably everyone who's listening to this can think of one in his or her last 20 years. It might be, you know, in my case, my mother died of smoking-associated illness, and you know, that's not the worst. People here have had worse. And for a large percentage of those, if we had well-functioning markets or well-functioning processes that didn't fall prey to what I'm describing, the tragedy wouldn't have happened. So, you know, the recent news about 40,000 people dying on the highways, that's just salient. And if you saw, you know, 5 of those families of those 40,000, probably wouldn't be a dry eye in the house. And that's what keeps me up at night. There are many problems that Republicans and Democrats have good solutions to that they could resolve, but that their ability to work with one another is compromised, not because they don't want to, but because they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs.
Well, our electoral system is invariably an adversary system, and it's built in to be that way, and a sort of confidence that competition, as in the economic marketplace, will more often than not produce.
But there are adversary systems and there are adversary systems. There are adversary systems where, you know, I'm just going to mention someone I admire, Senator Hatch, completely willing to work with people, Democrats, on, you know, name 5 issues. And the capacity of that people similarly situated to Senator Hatch to work together without endangering their electoral prospects is much worse than it was, and social media is a contributor, because they know as soon as they say, I'm working with that person on that issue, Twitter's going to go crazy. And it works for both Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah, well, I think we saw that in the vote on now Justice Gorsuch.
Yes, and I'll say that, you know, I'm on record as saying I thought the Democrats should have either voted for Justice Gorsuch or have had a soft, respectful no without a filibuster. That's my view. But a Democrat, even if he or she shared that view, to take that line, you are a demon on Twitter and Facebook. And to get yourself explained in those contexts is very challenging. And that contributed to, you know, over the last decade, a very unfortunate process for judges.
Let me just leave you with a thought that occurred to me while reading your book, which is perhaps off point, but it occurs to me that one of the places in which Americans still hear opposing political views is that extended family Thanksgiving Day, Christmas, other holiday treats. But on the other hand, our extended families in some ways are getting smaller. You have fewer children. That means that your children have fewer cousins. Do we know at all what's happening to those extended family discussions? I had one where we had socialists, we had a variety of people. My parents were Eisenhower and Lyndon Johnson voters. Has that gone the way of everybody going to the same movies every week?
It's a great question. And the data in other domains is consistent with the hypothesis that the degree of diversity at family get-togethers is smaller than it used to be. But I don't have the data that nails actually that particular issue. So there's been geographical sorting along political lines that is way higher than what was found in decades before. What's unclear, at least from my understanding of the data, is whether family members have internal disagreement. What we're finding for partyism is suggestive that there's less internal disagreement.
Well, and that was your statement towards the beginning, the data on, have your son marry a Republican.
If your uncle's a Republican and you're a Democrat, unless you dislike your uncle, you probably aren't going to be alarmed if your daughter marries, right? So the data is consistent with the hypothesis, which I don't know to be true, which is that there's been a diminution on that count.
Let me just conclude my remarks by quoting something that occurred to me that apropos of that earlier question about subsidiarity. The historian Robert Wiebe, who was at Northwestern for many years, wrote in his book, The Segmented Society, he said that over most of American history, and he's looking 19th century, early 20th in particular, Americans lived in small social units, primary circles of identity, values, associations, and goals. Americans could live together because they lived apart. Is that too much of a resigned, we just have to kind of live our, you get an extreme example. The writer Rod Dreher, the American conservative, has a book out called The Benedict Option, where he says that people of religious faith, of traditional Christian faith, I believe he's a Roman Catholic, should just wall themselves off from this vicious larger society, vicious as he sees it, and wall themselves and their families off, make their livings in some ways where they're not participating in what he regards as a corrupt and lascivious society. He's an interesting and serious person, and his model is the founder of the Saint Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine monasteries.
Okay, so as someone married in the Catholic Church to a Catholic woman, a marriage that was arranged with the help of the Catholic U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, Marianne Glendon, that is, she helped us get it authorized, who was gracious enough to do that. I'm really glad Catholics haven't walled themselves off. Two of my children, they wouldn't be my children at least. They wouldn't exist. So I couldn't disagree more strongly with that statement. And the reason is that there are very few things that are un-American, but that actually is un-American, where we understand America to be a nation that celebrates the capacity of people with very different foundational commitments to live together with not just geniality, but with something approaching love. And that's a pretty Christian thought as well as an American thought. So I have a different doctrine.
Okay. Let me open this up to the audience for questions, and we have people with microphones who can go around. And I would like to ask you to identify yourself and your organizational affiliation, which silo you come from. Greg, can we start off with?
My name's Greg Lukianoff. I'm a big fan of yours. I'm the president of FIRE. I'm a political liberal, but who a lot of times fights in the culture war and sometimes gets stereotyped as conservative. I'm working on a book right now with John Haidt, and I'm very interested in polarization, so I study your work a lot. Did you see the recent study, or at least the survey that people were talking about in response to your book, that talked about how that older people, the people least likely to use the internet, are actually more polarized than younger people? I mean, it's being referred to as a way of saying, no, this isn't really the case. I think the fact that it ended in 2012 is one of the reasons why you might have seen that effect more. But what did you think of that?
Okay, so I have read the paper. It's by two excellent people whom I really admire. So the paper finds that the growth in polarization has been greatest among older people, and young people, especially likely to use the internet, show a lower degree of increase in polarization over a recent period. It's a very gross account. Not in the sense that it's disgusting. There's nothing disgusting about this paper, but it operates with real aggregates. So the question is, what hypothesis particularly are they testing? So if the hypothesis is that those who use social media are more likely to be polarized than those who don't, their paper does falsify that hypothesis. But what we don't know from their paper is A, whether social media use is a polarizer among those who do use social media. The paper doesn't test that hypothesis. What's going on with the older people who've gotten all polarized, we don't know. Something's happening there.
But isn't it usually true that older people are more likely to have a fixed party identification than younger people, all other things being equal?
It might be, but what the drama of the paper is that older people are showing more split now than they were in an earlier
They're
year.
more likely to watch cable news.
So yes, fair. So there's nothing in their paper that's inconsistent with what's the name of this book? #Republic? There's nothing in their paper that's inconsistent with #Republic. So #Republic urges that social media is a contributor to political polarization, particularly for those people who are politically very engaged, who are self-sorting. And that the book has a ton of papers, not by the author, by others, that is supportive of that thesis. So let's call it the gross paper to which you refer, gross meaning aggregate data. It's a very interesting paper, but it's in no tension at all with the things that you and Professor Haidt and others are concerned with.
Okay. Another question, the lady in front.
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. I just wonder, you mentioned the Democrat and Republican. Now I'm thinking just in our society as a capitalism, people use the money as a measure of your achievement or your value, what to do next step. And before, probably in the 50s or 60s, maybe people just thinking about what do you want to achieve to improve the society, in a sense, a good reform. But now people, the thing about reform is how do you achieve to get the most money, like hire the CEO. So I just wonder, instead of say, how are we going to improve the society and improve the two-party system, now do you think we instead of people say, don't talk politics or religion, and now they are saying, don't talk about the parents because they are really opposed to your money values. So I just, what step do you think we got to improve our system so Democratic Party can really improve our society rather than too extreme?
Okay, so first point, I'm a big fan of capitalism. So the fact that ours is a capitalist system is a source of pride. Second, in a capitalist system, it is never the case that social value is uniformly associated with how much money people are able to obtain. And I mean the word never literally. That if you look at people who are greatly admired, a lot of them don't have a ton of money, or if they do, they're admired for their achievement, not for their money. So the view that the people who end up admired in various communities, it depends on what their characteristics are. Now, some people will admire them for their money, but that wouldn't be the median person. Says, you're great, money. And said, you're great, you built that, or you figured that out, or you help people, or there's a fantastic company. Steve Jobs is greatly admired. Is he admired because he's rich? No. He's admired because he built some sensational products. The idea that in the 50s people were more admired for their achievements and in the 2017 more for their money, that's theoretically possible, but I don't know of any evidence that it's true. That in the 50s, Joe DiMaggio, I think, was extremely admired.
They paid some of these baseball players $10,000 a year.
Yeah, not a whole lot of money, and even if he made plenty, he was Joe DiMaggio. He was rich guy. 56 consecutive games with hits. That was his achievement. So in terms of what to do, I would not focus on capitalism. I'd focus on private practices that are not inevitable, many of them very recent, that are contributors to the problem. In terms of government more macro, subsidiarity is one approach, which would make sense in some domains. In other domains, and this is a very contestable view, Madison's and Hamilton's conception was we wanted a deliberative democracy where there would be people whose job it would be to kind of figure things out, who would be specialists and experts, and they would be ultimately accountable to we the people, but it wouldn't be like referenda on their actions day by day. They'd be, knowledgeable and virtuous, and they'd do stuff. And in my view, that's an enduring insight. So if we want to do something about problem X, to authorize people who actually know something about problem X to move on it, whether it's food safety or traffic safety or infrastructure improvement, they wouldn't be the only people. We the people would be the ultimate arbiters, but they would have some space to do stuff. So the fact that in the United States, you can eat and not be afraid of getting sick, or you can mostly drive and not be afraid of getting crashed into, that's in part a tribute to capitalism and in part a tribute to the Madisonian vision, let's say.
Let's see, in the back, sir.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Todd Wiggins. I'd like to ask you from your perspective of being a Renaissance man, which in itself has quite a few pit holes because you know so much about so many different things. But if you were in a job interview right now, if someone were to ask you, what has been your greatest hit? Not just selling books, but in the sense of being able to exact change that was discernible, that people could say, you did change my life, or you caused me to do something different. Is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head that you're conscious of that you've actually affected someone in that way?
Do you know the song 22 by Taylor Swift? I wrote that song. I don't know. I think when I got to work in the government, there were some things that that I got to participate in that I hope were helpful. So one thing that a lot of people have experienced is the Global Entry TSA pre-program. I don't know if I'd say that's my greatest hit. I certainly wouldn't say that it's mine, but I got to participate in it. And there are programs that involve life-saving from various problems that people are potentially subject to that I got to participate in. So if there are some people who are around and I got to help with that, That's not as good as 22, but
Well, I would have to say, as a TSA pre-check and global entry traveler, you have probably saved or helped to save, maybe 40 hours of my life. So thank you, Commissioner. Yes. Director, I guess is my title.
Mark Epstein, no institutional affiliation, but I am in the Trump silo. My question is about the judges study. I don't know if you've considered this, but I'm wondering if you thought about how senatorial courtesy could affect it. So that's been expanded greatly in the last two administrations. So there were some circuits, like the Fourth Circuit and Second Circuit, are all Democratic senators, and the Fifth Circuit is all Republican. And I believe if you look at them, there was more Bush appointees in the Fifth Circuit and more Obama appointees in the First and Second, which would then make, because of the senatorial courtesy, the Republican appointees relatively more moderate in Democratic Senate states, and the Democratic appointees more Republican. And so that would affect the outcome.
okay, it's a great question. So there are two different issues. Issue number one, is judicial voting behavior affected by whether judges are sitting with people appointed by the president of the same party as the president who appointed them? And our data suggests that basically that happens in every circuit. So the patterns we describe are uniform across circuits. There was one, I think it's
And
this,
across party, as I heard
and
you.
across parties. So completely uniform, senatorial courtesy not. We're not detecting any differences in the extent to which a Democratic judge will vote more liberal linearly with the number of Democrats on the panel. So there's almost an iron law where the percentage of liberal votes grows with the number of Democrats on the panel. And it works for Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so that finding is uniform. There was one panel where we got some noise in the data. As I recall, it was the Sixth Circuit, where the Republicans aren't affected by the Democrats aren't affected by the Republicans, and that seems to be because they really don't like each other on that panel.
Well, the fact that they hired a food tester.
at the time.
No, I'm
Now,
making that up.
your point is a different point, which is that senatorial courtesy could be an ideological moderator. There's some data that supports what you say. In a period of senatorial courtesy, at one point I compiled data on this, where you didn't find ideological differences so stark between Democratic and Republican appointees. And that probably has something to do either with the fact of senatorial courtesy or with the fact that the issues weren't splitting people as much as they are now.
Or weren't splitting the parties as
weren't
much.
splitting the
I mean,
parties.
you know, you had the phenomenon in the Civil Rights Revolution period where the strongest pro-civil rights federal district and circuit judges were Republicans appointed
Completely.
by President Eisenhower.
Completely. So keep in mind, you're asking about whether senatorial courtesy can be a moderator of ideological division. The answer could be yes, not necessarily. It could heighten it, but it could be yes. That would be independent of the question, which is kind of the social media question, are we observing movements when people are in something like an echo chamber?
What blogs do law professors read? I mean, there are lots of law professors, but which law blogs do you pay attention to? You cited a couple of them in the book.
I pay attention to only two, and that is the Volokh Conspiracy, which I think is quite good. The authors are very strong. And it's not a law one, but it's just so good. I don't think I'm a Renaissance man, but a more law professor guy. But Tyler Cowen is a Renaissance man.
Marginal Revolution.
So Marginal Revolution, great.
Marginal Revolution.
Yeah, and on everything, Tyler Cowen is interesting and inventive. And he has some interesting, he's not a lawyer, he has interesting things to say about law. So those two. I am these days down on blogs, by the way. Not in the sense that they're useless, but do you know the word take? What's your take?
Yeah.
That's a really bad phrase, isn't it? Because if you have a take on something, chances are you shouldn't say it. And blogs are, you get, a take is just...
A take is your attitude or response to something. Am I reading it correctly?
Yeah, completely. And so your take is I know this because I have some friends I admire who write blog posts, and they say on Twitter, for my take, see this, and then I read it, and they're really intelligent. What they produced is, oh my God. It's so superficial.
Well, one rule I've tried to develop is if I read the headline, which sometimes they're not connected to the article, and I can sort of write the whole rest of it in my head, I'm not going to bother because I already know what they're going to say and have my own response to the argument.
Most law professors that I know spend very little time with blogs, but Volek is very much worth reading, and Tyler Cowen is always worth 10 times the amount of time it would actually take to read him.
Although parsing some of his prose the other day got to be a little tricky, but let's see, we have other questions here. Let's have this young man here.
Ian Mason, Breitbart News. I wanted to ask you about the public forum doctrine and its potential application to social media. In addition to prohibitions usually on harassment and other sort of tortious speech, most social media networks have pretty strong both written codes and measures to combat so-called hate speech. Could that pass a potential application to the viewpoint neutral requirement of the public forum doctrine?
Okay, there's a lot.
You're talking about the doctrine of the First Amendment doctrine.
Yes, there's a lot there. So let's separate two different ideas. One idea is that the streets and parks are public fora in the sense that they're open to expressive activity, even if people don't want them to be. So the public forum doctrine says that subject to time, place, and manner restrictions, you just have to have that stuff open. And that's a very unusual First Amendment doctrine because it's not about protecting against government censorship of disliked speech. It's about providing spaces where people can communicate. And that space, any tyrant, when he or she gets in office, closes the public spaces. And that's different from censoring disagreement. So the public forum doctrine seems to me a kind of what is an outlier in our free speech tradition. And it applies to separate the various ideas, not just to content discriminatory restrictions, but also to content neutral restrictions. If you said the streets and parks aren't open for expressive activity between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m., that would probably be struck down, even though it's content neutral. Or if you said something that would be viewpoint neutral, which is you can't use the word war on a public forum, that would be struck down like that. It is content-based, but it's viewpoint neutral. So the public forum doctrine is about spaces. Then there's the ban on content discrimination, which is actually a little tricky. There's a per se ban on viewpoint discrimination. Content discrimination must meet a big burden of justification, but it might be okay. So if you said you can't use there's the hate speech seems viewpoint neutral, but content based. So if you go up to people and say something that's predictably going to produce violence, then under the existing doctrine, that can be regulated. Now, what counts as hate speech is a very narrow definition. So if you go in someone's face and think of the worst things that can be that will particularly produce violence, that can be regulated. But if you say something like, you're the political person who you like best is a crook and a whore, and God had a bad day when that person was born, that's pretty hateful, but it's not hate speech. It's not regulable. So the question is, does hate speech, very narrowly defined, is regulable anywhere, public forum or not? Once you expand it from the very narrow legal conception of hate speech to, let's say, the ordinary language conception of hateful communication, then no regulations allowed. And that's, in the abstract, that's good, because notwithstanding, I think the concerns we should have about incivility, to ban in civil speech wouldn't be very civil. in a society which treasures robust and often inflamed, political discussion.
Let's ask this gentleman last question.
Thank you. My name is Will Reinhardt. I am actually a former social media researcher, and now I'm into tech policy here in DC. I work for a think tank called the American Action Forum. I just wanted to actually push back on something and ask kind of a question about effectiveness. So you talked a little bit about serendipity as a way, within social media as a way to combat this polarization. And yet it seems to me when the events that you were talking about actually are kind of serendipitous in their own way, that when you get these people who are, in Boulder as compared to Colorado Springs in the same room, they actually go more extreme, even though they're a little bit more middle as far as the results are concerned. That seems to me to be the same thing as the serendipitous project in some way that you'd suggested for social media. So given kind of what we know since Granovetter, what do you think is the effectiveness of that going to be, and other remedies? Because the more and more I look at this, I'm just not sure what the most effective remedy is.
Okay, good. On 2 points, good. First, you're picking up on an ambiguity in the word serendipity, and second, you're picking up on lack of clarity about what remedy would be effective. So by serendipity, I actually mean something a little more particular than the word, which is exposure to ideas or points of view that you never would have selected to see and that don't necessarily fit with your antecedent views. So on that view, if you as a Boulder person serendipitously find yourself in a room with a zillion people from Boulder, and it just worked out that way because of where people marched on Tuesday at 4 p.m., that is serendipitous, but not in the sense that I mean. So I mean serendipity that it's like you're reading the daily newspaper and you see some story about Turkey and you had no interest in Turkey and you thought it was food, but there's an authoritarian crackdown there, and that could change what you do that day, and in over the course of a human year, change a non-trivial number of people's lives. They'll actually try to do something about that. So that's a topic, or it might be a point of view. You might think, to give an example, University of Chicago people, and I remain in many respects one, are fond of, you might see a story about the minimum wage that shows you that it's the significant increase of throwing a lot of people out of work, and you might start not liking the minimum wage very much. And that might affect, or at least significant increases you might not like very much. And that might affect your attitude and how you talk to one another, which might have some policy implication if the number of people is enough. So that's the idea of serendipity. It's a little more, we don't have a word quite. The Germans probably do, because they have particular of serendipity in this precise sense I mean. Now, in terms of effectiveness, if you feel, adamant that, take your preferred issue, that the Holocaust happened. I'm adamant on that. And then you read stuff that says, actually, it didn't happen. That's not going to change you. And for many people, many political issues are like that. So the bet, which is not inconsistent with the data, is that many Americans on a wide range of issues, they don't think of issues as like the Holocaust. They might think of that about, Obamacare. They might think, I love that, and nothing's going to change me. Or I don't like that, nothing's going to change me. But even there, you might think, I love the Obamacare, but I read something about some provision that's causing a problem. And I don't like that. Or you might think, as many people do, I don't like Obamacare, but the idea of calorie labels at chain restaurants, I'm fine with that. So, and at least if the data suggests that's a decent thing. So the effectiveness notion that you're right to press on, the first approximation answer is where people aren't like George Lucas with respect to the death of Luke Skywalker, meaning not going to happen, then something might be moved. And notice, if you would, in Return of the Jedi, Yoda did die. Kasdan made some progress.
So I want to thank you for a very interesting presentation. Concluded appropriately on Star Wars. Please join me in thanking Professor Cass Sunstein.